Hey everybody, so glad that you are here for our second week of community groups. We're actually starting lesson 1 today. Our subject matter this series, this semester is called In the Gap. I'm glad that you're here. I feel really good about this series of where we're going, and it's inspiring. So tonight I want to talk to you about Nehemiah. Nehemiah identified a problem to solve. You see, for centuries, God's people had worshiped there in the presence of God. His Shekinah glory dwelt in the Holy of Holies, in the innermost parts of the temple. Miracles happened every day. No matter which way the wind blew, the smoke from the sacrifices always went straight up to heaven. In the fields, God gave them a great crop in the 6th year so they could take the next year, a sabbatical year off from their labor. Now, all that was gone. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was torn down and looted. After many years, God's people began to return to their homeland. Zerubbabel and Ezra led the first group. You see, they restored the altar, thank God for altars, the sacrifices, thank God for sacrifices, and worship to God. You see, about 25 years later, a new temple was built and dedicated. Now let me pick up and catch up to Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a Jewish man who had remained in Persia. His story begins 141 years after the fall of Jerusalem. Before we continue with Nehemiah's story of courage, we need to understand something about the ancient culture and the biblical truth from the Old and New Testaments. The temple was a place where heaven and earth met, where they touched one another. The place where God dwelled in his awesome glory. You see, the wall around the city protected the temple. The temple was valuable. The house of God was priceless and precious. You are not your own. You are bought with a price. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and I quote a little bit here, therefore honor God with your body. We now are the place where heaven and earth meet. God's Spirit touches our spirit, heaven to earth, humanity to divinity. And we need to build walls of protection to defend and cherish God's glory within us. Walls of integrity, I would submit to you. Walls of obedience, faith, hope, and love. So, when we read about the events that occurred in Nehemiah's life so long ago, we can make specific applications in our own lives. You see, Nehemiah is a great story, but I want it to touch our lives. All around us, the enemy attacks people, but some are too absorbed with doubt, greed, and even fear to fight back. But sometimes it's not just our family members. It's friends or it's coworkers who are devastated. Or sometimes it's even us. You see, God is always looking for someone to stand in the gap. Stand in the gap. One day in the capital of Susa, he saw Hanani, one of his brothers who had just come back from Judah, which was 766 miles away. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a long travel today in a car. Back then, it was a very long way. But Nehemiah asked him how things were going back in their homeland. And he reported that the people of Jerusalem was in big trouble. Hey, there's problems. Outsiders are harassing the citizens. Things are happening to wives and children. They're stealing from people. and no one could do anything about it. We are in need. We are scared. We feel hopeless. But this is what I know. With revelation comes responsibility. And for Nehemiah, hearing this news broke his heart. It devastated him. Many of us get the sequence wrong. For us, it's fire, ready, aim. No, Nehemiah's heart was shattered, but he knew he needed to prepare before he acted. For days, the Bible says he wept, he fasted, he prayed. What is he doing? He's standing in the gap. The condition of God's people in their homeland was simply unacceptable to Nehemiah. God gave Nehemiah a holy discontent, a fire in his bones to make a difference. His prayer wasn't an outburst of anger or self-pity. He didn't even demand anything from God. Instead, he focused his heart on the greatness and grace of God. Let me remind someone tonight, today, this week, prayer is a weapon against the schemes and attacks of the enemy. It puts us in touch with God's heart, his power, and his grace. Nehemiah wasn't a prophet, a priest, or a Levite. Nehemiah was just an ordinary man with an extraordinary heart for God. We desperately need to tap into the wisdom and strength of God so that we'll be ready to do whatever he calls us to do, standing in the gap for someone or something. Nehemiah exemplified the gap person trait of being able to identify a problem, then craft a plan to meet it. He didn't just hope the problem would go away. How many times have we hoped that and we wish? That's not what Nehemiah did. He didn't just push off on someone else and, oh, someone else will do it, someone else will take care of it. But Nehemiah felt the weight of the responsibility to rebuild the devastated walls of the capital of his ancient homeland. For 140 years, there had been no more than mounds of crumpled stone and rubble. It was God's idea, and he was God's messenger and servant. Nehemiah was inviting them to join him in this great work. They replied in Nehemiah 2:18, "Let us start rebuilding." Several people, Sanballat, Talbot, and Geshem, mocked Nehemiah, the men who agreed to help him rebuild the walls. You see, standing in the gap involves difficult situations, and it invites opposition at times. That discourages people. That pushes some people out. If you want to stand in the gap for people in your family or your community, some people will ridicule you, mock you, and try to intimidate you. Your courage and faith threatens them, so they'll do anything they can to make you compromise. When work on the walls proceeded and success was in sight, opposition intensified. Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs and the Amorites were furious. They plotted to attack Nehemiah and the project and his men. You see, for us, division comes in two forms, internally and externally. Our enemy tries to create a divided heart, to attempt us to pursue things that aren't God's best. Our enemy also wants to create a division between people. Conflict isn't the problem, rather unresolved conflict is. Unhealed wounds, unfounded gossip, unforgiven sins, and unrelenting resentment drive a deep wedge that can't be smothered by a smile or even a God bless you. For Nehemiah and for us, a half-completed wall isn't enough protection. We need to finish the work, finish the project no matter what it takes. Miraculously, Nehemiah and his men completed the work to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in only 52 days. They had been lying in ruins for 141 years, but Nehemiah stood in the gap. I don't know how many times Nehemiah got discouraged, but he kept looking for God and for hope and strength. I don't know how many times people complained about all the work, but Nehemiah just smiled and said, "Keep working. God is with us." I don't know how many lies were told about him, but he trusted God with his reputation. I know the storms were furious. God didn't protect him from experiencing the storms, but he gave Nehemiah and his men courage to weather the storms. Sometimes we stand in the gap for a cause or a person for a short time, and then our role is over. Every time we see Jesus in the gospel, he's standing in the gap for someone, for people. When the religious leaders wanted to stone a woman caught in adultery, Jesus stood between her and her accusers. He stood in the gap. When blindness or sickness or deformity threatened to ruin a person's life, Jesus again stood in the gap to heal. When sin crushed a person's soul, Jesus stood in the gap to offer love and forgiveness. When death took his friend Lazarus, Jesus' heart was broken, but he stood in the gap to bring life from a tomb. Do you see a problem to solve? Of course we do. Is it your lost child, an angry spouse, your addicted brother or sister, a depressed parent, your annoying neighbor, a demanding coworker, or something else tugging at your heart? Let compassion fuel your courage to do something about it. Somewhere in your life, somewhere in your circle of influence, maybe somewhere in your circle of concern, there's somebody that's hurting, that they don't know to ask you, but we know that I need to stand in the gap. Behind the scenes, at a prayer room, at my couch on my knees, or somewhere in my home, somebody might be counting on you to stand in the gap. Your assignment this week is to simply do this. Go about your week asking God, who should you be standing in the gap for this week? And if God lays some situation on your heart, God lays a person, a family, a marriage, anything that would come to your spirit, then I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to ask you as your pastor to stand in the gap for them or that situation this week. Let's see how God's going to use us.